Good evening to those of you watching us on YouTube and Facebook. You're watching the Courier Journal's coverage of election 2023. I'm Kirby Adams here in the Courier Journal newsroom, along with Joe Girth, Philip Bailey, and Eleanor McCrary, our group of experts tonight. We're going to talk politics, obviously. The polls have now closed across the state, and early numbers are starting to come in. Of course, the big story here in the state of Kentucky is the race for governor. So let's start off with that.
This may be the last time for the next couple of decades that we see a Democrat elected as the governor of Kentucky, if Andy Beshear can pull off a re-election tonight. He won 4 years ago based largely on the amount of dislike people had in Kentucky for former Governor Matt Bevin. This time we're going to find out if people actually like Beshear or not so much.
And early numbers are starting to come in a little bit, so we're getting an indication, I suppose.
Right. I mean,
but I want to say early.
Very, very early. I mean, those early voting numbers, I think, being indicated that Democrats certainly had the edge in that, right? This is the first election that we've had in Kentucky's history where early voting has happened. Where we had 3 days of that. We didn't have that back in 2019. The numbers that we've calculated here at the Courier Journal with the help of the Secretary of State's office, Democrats have the edge in that. Mm-hmm. That's typically how it is nationwide, right? Democrats are often more engaged, right, and more enthusiastic about early voting than the Republican counterparts.
And part of that is because of Donald Trump.
Right. I mean, Trump has always talked bad about early voting, mail-in voting. So Democrats have been more plugged into that.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Democrats have been more plugged into that, and I think what we're seeing is the reflection of that in those early numbers. What I look for, Kirby, is will Daniel Cameron, the Attorney General, be able to flip some of those counties that Andy Beshear beat Matt Bevin in by 3% or less? Warren County, Kenton County, Breathitt, Knott, Madison County, where sometimes we were talking about elections in those counties that were determined in that gubernatorial race in 2019 by sometimes 74 or 100 something votes, right? So if Daniel Cameron can flip those, that's a good sign for him. But I think there's also going to be a sign for Andy Beshear to flip some of those counties that he barely lost.
And the one thing we really have to look for here is Jefferson County. That's where the vast number of Democratic voters are in Kentucky. 4 years ago, Beshear won it by more than 98,000 votes. And so he's got to get somewhere in the 90,000 vote margin area for him to win in the state. Most people are thinking could go a little bit below that, depending on what some of these other states do or what some of these other counties do. But he's looking, though, I'm sure, to outdo that if he can, because it was an amazingly close race 4 years ago. He won by 5,086 votes. That's less than 1.4 votes per precinct. And that was just a terribly close race that he does not want to live through again.
Right. I think the other thing we have to take into account, Kirby, is not just Daniel Cameron trying to flip those counties, but as Joe said, that margin in Jefferson County. Look, Daniel Cameron has hung his race at the final leg of this. He knows Andy Beshear is popular. Even in his own ad, he says he's a nice
guy.
Right. And when you talk to, as I've talked to Cameron supporters who are really into his message about family, really anti-trans message, they're really into, they'll say, but I still like Andy Beshear. Mm-hmm. Right? Andy Beshear's popularity, he's one of the most popular political figures in the country, and very rarely do incumbent governors lose. But I also think we have to remember, just as Daniel Cameron's trying to nationalize this race with the endorsement of Donald Trump and saying that this is crazy versus normal, remember there are a lot of angry liberals out there too. This is the post-January 6th race for Kentucky. This is the post-Dobbs decision for the Supreme Court restricting abortion. And many people, Chuck Todd and other national observers included, will argue that the best ad of the entire cycle, right, across not just Kentucky but in Mississippi, the Ohio referendums, et cetera, the best ad was that Andy Beshear ad talking about abortion, where you had that young lady who said, I was raped as a 12-year-old, sort of, blasting the Attorney General's position on abortion. So I think there's just as much energy among some on the left. The last part here is we still don't know how much of that Breonna Taylor vote, right, the loathing, the hatred of Daniel Cameron in the African-American community, where you've seen some of these very vicious ads basically saying he's a race traitor, right? You're seeing a lot of those ads pop up. I'm wondering how much of that energy is going to pop up, not just from people who
follows through.
Not just who ran ads, but who are organizing in Louisville and Lexington and outside those Democratic strongholds. How much of that vote could be added to Beshear's number as well? So this is a race in which, look, we're seeing the numbers trickling now. I don't think anyone truly knows how close this could be, but I think there's so many different items that we're juggling. It's Andy Beshear's irresistible force, right? He's aw shucks offensive that he's gone on versus the immovable object of Kentucky's conservatism. That's why this race is so compelling, I think, nationally.
And I think also one of the things that we were talking about earlier was just, it's not just, we're coming to you from Louisville, but it's statewide, and there's a very different ad campaign going up in the northern part of Kentucky, right? And with the people that are seeing the Ohio television ads and that type of thing, I think that's very interesting to realize that it's not just what we see here.
Right. The exit polling up in the exit polling in Ohio is showing that 61% of the people there favor some sort of abortion rights. There's a constitutional amendment going on up there that is really taking all the air out of the room in the state of Ohio, and all the voters in northern Kentucky, Boone, Kenton, Campbell, and some of those ring counties up there are seeing these same ads. They're being geared toward the voters in Cincinnati. And so the question then becomes, what sort of impact do those ads on this abortion issue have in the Kentucky governor's race?
Right.
National Democratic groups have shown me polling that shows that Matt Bevin's negatives there are high as -17, right? So Democrats are very hopeful that they can flip, and the Bashir people think they can flip Boone County. So for Daniel Cameron, the Cincinnati suburbs, northern Kentucky used to be the Tea Party stronghold, right? It used to be a very reliable conservative area, but it's been very competitive politically. Think about Fort Mitchell, right? The city of Fort Mitchell up there. So I agree with Joe. The Ohio referendum on abortion, mixed with Andy Bashir's ad leaning into abortion, which I think now is showing Democrats nationally that abortion is now their issue post-Dobbs. I think those two things. Also remember the Brent Spence Bridge project with the lack of tolls. Andy Bashir doesn't mention this, but that comes from the infrastructure bill that President Joe Biden got through. But that has become a popular item up there for him as well. So northern Kentucky is a battleground that it wasn't necessarily 5 or 6 years ago.
I think one of the things too that you mentioned in the very beginning of our streaming here was the fact that it's sort of a hatred for Bevin that is helping to kind of fuel some of what we're seeing happening. But that came to play in the ads up in the north too, because they were putting Daniel Cameron in so many ads where Bevin's face was right there with them.
Yeah, trying to mix the two and confuse you and say, oh, he's a continuation of Matt Bevin. I think we do have to, though, give some credit, though, to the fact that the Attorney General isn't Matt Bevin.
Right.
As much as we talk
He's
about
not.
Andy Bashir's popularity and how likable he is, Daniel Cameron is much more likable than Matt Bevin. Well, you can't really get less likable than Matt Bevin. But, I think the Attorney General should be given some credit for his charisma here and his ability to close that gap.
And he is charismatic,
Right,
and I didn't mean to say that he is Matt Bevin, but I think it's interesting the way ads change throughout the state, and they're very targeted to they're smart. Those putting them together. Now, Eleanor, I don't want to leave you out completely here. We're talking about the governor. We can come back to the governor's race, but let's talk a little bit about what's going on here in Jefferson County. And let's start off with what I think is very interesting: the wet dry vote that's taking place over in Clifton Heights.
Yeah, so that's going to be voter precinct N163. So there's a little over 300 registered voters.
And I think we have a map here too that we can bring up because it's a tiny little spot, right?
Yeah.
You said 300 voters?
About 300, yeah. It's very small.
And kind of describe to our viewers where it's located in Jefferson County.
So it's kind of between Clifton and Clifton Heights. It runs parallel to Frankfort Avenue, right around Brownsboro Road. And so it's mostly residential in that area, and there's a small...
The Kroger's by there.
The Kroger is by there.
There's a lovely Kroger.
We won't say the nickname for that Kroger.
And there is a small, kind of like, I don't know, shopping, not like a mall, but just like a strip right there with some businesses. And one of those is Virtue Bar and Lounge, and that's been kind of a main crux of this
Virtue Bar and Lounge.
issue.
Is it new in that area?
Yeah, so it just moved. It used to be in Old Louisville, and it relocated to that area a little over a year ago. And so some residents they believe that the bar has been drawing more nuisance behavior to the area. And it's been very blatant that this wet dry vote is an attempt to either shut down or cause this bar to move or somehow reduce the nuisance behavior that they are associating with the area.
Are there other venues there that sell alcohol? Are there restaurants that this will affect, like little shops?
Not a ton.
Okay.
So there's a Family Dollar in that same area. They do sell beer and they have an ABC license, and so that would stop the Family Dollar from selling beer if this does pass. And then there is another liquor store that has applied for their ABC licenses, and they're trying to get established in that same plaza. There's kind of a older abandoned building that's just been open for a while, and so if this does pass, I mean, that whole business model would not be able to come to fruition.
So you talked to, was it residents of that area and the business owner?
Yeah, so some of the residents didn't feel super comfortable talking and having their names. So I talked to the Clifton Heights community or neighborhood council president, and her name is Allison Johnson. And yeah, she's kind of been a representative of the voices of the neighborhood. And they feel like since Virtue Bar has been there, they've noticed litter in their yards, car racing, things like that, and they believe it's tied to the bar. But the bar owner, Tony Frank, he said, they deal with some of the same issues. He brought up homelessness as well and said this is a larger problem than just this neighborhood or this bar. And I've talked to him today. He's feeling anxious about the vote. About 40% of their revenue comes from alcohol sales.
Yeah.
So,
not a very fun bar if there's no alcohol sales.
You drink some water, a Sprite maybe.
Well,
No, I was going to say,
Oxygen.
stay
bar.
hydrated.
yeah. I was going to ask, we've had these wet dry votes obviously in Louisville in the past. The one thing, Eleanor, I noticed is, do we have sort of any sense of like the racial element of it, which is that this is a predominantly white neighborhood. This is a black bar owner, and it seems that part of that is the friction of this. People who've talked to me about it, at least, it seems to be an issue for them. Is that coming up at all in this race or contest?
yeah, so Tony Frank, the bar owner, definitely feels like there are racial undertones to it. And so it's part of Councilman Ja'Cory Arthur's district as well. And he has also expressed that to me, that he's heard phrases from neighbors say, well, I don't want this type of clientele around me, and things like that. And to him, that has very much felt like a racial dog whistle. And Allison Johnson, when I've spoken to her, said, we weren't aware this was a racial issue. We're just not happy with the behavior. So the residents themselves have not said that, but there are signs that people are very much interpreting this as a racial issue.
Okay, so I guess we'll see what happens with that. How about Metro Council?
Yeah, so there are...
This is a special election for Metro Council.
It is, yeah. Normally there wouldn't be any seats up this year, but 2 Metro councilors joined the Greenberg administration, and then one, Cassie Chambers Armstrong, took Morgan McGarvey's seat in the state senate. And so we have District 3, District 6, and District 8 up today. And so, those numbers are coming in. The interesting, I think, thing about this as well is for the even seats, so District 6, which is around Old Louisville, and 8, which is around the Highlands, the traditional year for the even seats to go up for election is next year. And so whoever wins these elections, if they choose to do it
all over
again,
again.
they will have to immediately start campaigning again for the primary and then the election next
Hang on
year.
to those signs, right? You got something big coming in, I can tell.
I've
Excuse
got-
me, Eleanor.
I've got a couple interesting things coming in. In Powell County, which Bevan won 4 years ago with a little bit over 50, nearly 52% of the vote, Andy Bashir has won by one single vote. And in Breathitt County, where Bashir...
I have about all of this is, we'll go back out into the state again. Although wanted to let you finish if you were still...
That was
This
all
just
I had
in.
for now, yeah.
Attorney General's race as well. And if more comes in on Andy Bashir and Daniel Cameron, please just jump in. But let's talk a little bit about that race. What's going on there?
Well, you have Republican Russell Coleman, former U.S. attorney, running against Democrat Pamela Stevenson, a state representative out of Louisville. Look, in that race, I think we've seen what the bigger problem is for the Democrats in Kentucky. Outside of Andy Bashir, right? Let's look at the past 10 years of electoral politics in Kentucky. We've had 16 statewide races, whether for state constitutional office or U.S. Senate. Of those 16 races, Democrats have won 3, and barely. And those were with old school Democratic names, Allison Lundigan Grimes, right, and Andy Bashir. So there hasn't been a lot of good news for for Democrats as of late. So I think we're seeing that in these down ballot races. It was 4 years ago where Republicans were telling me, we don't have an electoral problem. We have a Matt Bevin problem. And I think one thing we're going to see here is that Andy Beshear has ingratiated himself to Kentuckians in a way that no other red state Democrat can really match.
Well, and on top of that, Beshears have been getting elected in Kentucky in statewide offices since 1979.
Right, yeah.
And so people are used to
That name.
voting. Yeah, they're used to voting for Beshears. The name Beshear does not scare them, no matter how much Daniel Cameron goes out and says crazy versus not crazy sort of thing. They don't. A lot of voters aren't going to see Beshear as crazy just because they voted for him.
And that was
in the past.
Andy Beshear's closing ad too. It was "You Know Me,"
Yeah.
Yeah.
which certainly was a tip of the hat to his father, former Governor Steve Beshear. And I think what we're seeing in these numbers here is that familiarity that they have. And I think with these down ballot races, the reason why Pamela Stevenson and Michael Bowman and other Democrats have such a hard time getting through is because they're not known.
Yeah.
Right? There's not that relationship of 45 years
Right.
that the Beshears have.
And people out there are going in and they're voting generally for the party they like, unless they like the candidate himself even more. And if they don't know the candidate, they're not going to be voting for that.
And we talked also about how you think about different aspects of what led to each of these people running for governor. And personally, I think of Andy Beshear as the person who led us through COVID. Now, whether or not you like the way he led us through COVID or not, that he led us through COVID.
Yeah, I mean, for those 3 or 4 months, right, during the pandemic, I mean, I had Republicans who were calling me who were just furious at the idea because Andy Beshear had the audience to himself, right? And not just because he was doing those press conferences every day at 5 and reassuring people during the pandemic, but it was the fact that, Kentucky has a very fractured media. Here in Louisville, we share it with Indiana and
Yeah,
certain
that's
parts
true.
of Western Kentucky, Bowling Green shares it with Tennessee. In Cincinnati, they get most of their news in Northern Kentucky from the Cincinnati media market. It was the fact that Andy Beshear had everyone's attention from Paducah to Pikeville every day.
Yeah, I mean, his audience was 2 million people some days.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just amazing what sort of audience he could draw with those afternoon fireside chats.
That plus
Right.
the tornadoes, plus the flooding. You talk to average Kentuckians, right, voters out there who are conservative people, who agree with a lot of Daniel Cameron's policy proposals, who voted for Donald Trump, and they'll tell you, but I like Andy, right? It wasn't the governor. It became Andy himself. And there was some polling that was leaked to us at USA Today that showed from Democratic groups that showed that in some places, Andy Beshear was more popular than Donald Trump. His favorability ratings, net favorables, were above Donald Trump's. So again, when Sherrod Brown's campaign in Ohio, when John Tester's campaign gearing up in Montana, when Joe Manchin's campaign in West Virginia, all are asking, what is Andy Beshear? What does he have that I don't have, right? I think Joe points that out here. I think the other thing we have to realize is that if Andy Beshear wins tonight, his star shoots through the roof. He is not someone who will simply be seen as a Kentucky Democrat. He's going to be a national Democrat. I talked to Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey, the chairman of the Democratic Governors Association, and he is over the moon about Andy Beshear. And he says, look, Andy Beshear, if he wins, will have the pick of the litter. He could be someone who could be a vice president for Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. So if Andy Beshear wins tonight, his name will be mentioned not just as a cabinet position, not just for U.S. Senate potentially in 2026. He could be a vice presidential candidate in no time.
I think with that, we made, I mean, that was.
Not to shut everything down. There's more. There's more. Stay tuned.
There
please.
is more. But I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and do this. Let's take a break. We'll come back at 9 o'clock when we have numbers and we can give you some actual results. And until then, we'll be working back behind the